Welcome. This is an experience in storytelling. The title of our little show is called The Story Matters. Whose story matters? Well, your story matters, and our story matters, and this, the story of our friends who are here to be with us, and the story of all of us matter, because story is really a very special thing. Uh, the two people who are with us in this partnership is Cecily Watson and August Hutchinson, and they are producers of a show at the college called Moth. Now, you're producers, so that means you have to pick the stories to be heard. So, what stories seem to draw you? Can you give us an example?
Well, for me, it's the really good and true stories that you can learn something from. And a great example of this comes from a former Moth producer. Actually, his grandfather was in the Air Force in World War II, and his plane was coming into land in a Chinese airstrip. He was next to the pilot. But little did anyone in the plane know that when the landing gear was deployed, it failed to deploy. So when they came to the ground, they didn't land, they crashed. And his grandfather went flying out through the front window, through the air, landed in a rice paddy. And because the rice paddy is wet and soft and that cushioned his fall, he survived. Unfortunately, for the man next to him, he was stuck in because he wore his seatbelt. What happened is that his grandfather, just before they landed, he took off his seatbelt, reached under his seat to get something. And so he flew out of the plane. The other man was held in and unfortunately perished. So the producer's grandfather lived because he did not wear his seatbelt. But the story does not end there, because a few years later he goes back home and he's got a job where he's got to fly across the country. So he hops into a commercial jet, gets in next to one of those emergency doors, we've all been in them, right, and buckles his seatbelt. Then, mid-flight, the emergency door malfunctions, and by malfunctions I mean it detached from the plane and went flying off and down to the ground. And he got sucked out with the air pressure. But because he was wearing his seatbelt, it held him in until they landed. And so he lived because he wore his seatbelt. And for me, I not only think that's a really intriguing story, but it tells me that just for things to go right sometimes, there's no amount of preparation you can do, and that circumstance kind of just has to be on your side.
That's a great story. How about you, Cecily?
Celia.
Celia.
Yeah, I think a lot about stories that you've had a little bit of time from, and I think as producers, when we work with people workshopping and stories they want to tell, it's really interesting to think about how much time since the event happened. For me, that's been really helpful just in terms of my own storytelling as well as just like life in general. So one of the things that I always remember, and actually the first condensed version of the first story I told here at the Middlebury Moth was started back in high school, and it's about how I broke my sort of rebellious streak, per se. So in high school, I was always one of those girls that's typically follows the rules. Generally, I went to a high school that had a uniform, so like stayed to the uniform code. I got good grades, and I kind of just went along with the flow. I didn't really want to break the rules very much. So that changed a little bit when one of my friends, who was a boarder, who lived in one of the dorms on campus, and I was a day student because it was half day, half boarding. She was like, "Oh, Celia, just like come over to my dorm and we can just hang out for a little bit." But I'm like, "Amanda, like I don't want to break, I don't want to get in trouble. Like the dorm parents are going to be around. Like I don't want to do it." And she's like, it's fine, like you'll be okay." And I'm like, "Okay." So I go to her dorm. We're just hanging out for a while. And then all of a sudden I hear the sound of these keys jingling at the door. And I start like getting chills down my body because everyone kind of knows what that means. And the dorm parent at the time was like this short woman with like short white blonde hair, who had come from a background in like mountain ranging and like the Navy. And she was known for being so adhering to rules and the uniform, so much that she wore the uniform herself of the high school. And she had the uniform like placarded on the classroom wall. She was always very much like girls, like knee-length skirts, boys, clean-shaven. She was the dorm parent, so I was like, oh God, like I am like really in trouble. Stood behind the door. I started kind of swearing a lot because I was really freaked out, and Amanda's roommate just calmed me and reassured me, and dorm parents like, how are we doing, girls? Like, did you check, like, make your bed and everything? And it was fine. And then the door was left open, and I couldn't get out, essentially, without walking past the door and seeing her bike there and getting in trouble. So Amanda was like, well, you're gonna have to get out somehow. Like, I can't keep you in here. So the best way we decided was to jump out the window, which was not her window, but like her neighbor's window. So what I had to do was like sprint across the hallway and then run over some stranger's bed and like open up the window and climb on her mattress and like get out. And luckily it was a first story room, so it wasn't, I just kind of stepped over. But I just felt this huge rush of adrenaline. I was like, oh my gosh, like I made it out. I like sprinted around the car park because I did not want to be in trouble. And I guess at that moment, that was really when I gained a lot more confidence. So just being like, I can, you know, it's okay to just, if something's not right, you know, that's how change is made. And eventually that kind of spurred me, I guess, more subconsciously to help start a gay-straight alliance at my high school. Because I'm straight, but a lot of my friends wanted to start this group, and I believed it was really important. My high school was also very conservative. And so that led to a series of things like doing this underground movie screening, and like, you know, we couldn't publish in the newspaper or like the yearbook, but eventually tying into, you know, this movie, and we had the Laramie Project and Matthew Shepard all connected to the school, and I eventually like dyed a streak of my hair blue, like literally, and I gave a speech in high school and told it to the whole school, just like telling them about this club and how important it was. And some people probably weren't happy about it, but I was happy, and I think my the dorm parent was happy as well.
So this rebellion, well, you both have great stories. Thank you for that. This rebellious period, was this the beginning of storytelling for you, or?
I guess it's like something I've been doing for a while. I started out much more like the Englishy side. I'm an English and theater joint major, so I'm always drawn to like poems and writing. And then in middle school, I sort of thought about, like, how do I make a good story when you read it? It's like, how do you create one that's not like contrived? And then I started much more in the fiction realm. But now, as I'm here and learning more about nonfiction storytelling, how can you use real life events to create a piece of narrative, and as well as like a form of expression too, because you can have a lot of expression through that.
Yeah. And being a history major myself, my thing is, you know, nonfiction narratives, trying to make them, you know, good. And I do my best. I think one of my favorite storytelling elements is humor, right? Keeps people upbeat, keeps them interested. And I think there's this historical story, little biography that I really like about the abridged story of Tycho Brahe. Okay, so this dude lived in the 1500s. He was a lord, and so he had his own land with peasants to rule. But it wasn't just any fiefdom. It was an island fiefdom. So he had his own island, pretty much, and he was on a castle, Uranusborg Castle, running this whole thing. And he wasn't just a lord, though. He was also an astronomer. That was his claim to fame. So next to his castle, he built an underground lair, with his observatory open to the sky through a dome. And in it, he stuffed it full of astronomical devices. So, you know, many of which he actually invented and built with his own hands. He also stuffed it full of servants, his peasants, who he kept in line with one of your classic dungeons, castle dungeons, you know, with your chains, your torture tools, all that sort of stuff. So basically, what you have is in the 1500s, in an underground lair, full of minions, next to a dungeon castle, on an island in the middle of the sea, you've got this evil genius mad scientist doing a bunch of research, right? And he's overturning all sorts of ideas about the world, right? So he discovers supernovas, which destroy this millennia-old idea that the heavens are constant. And he tracks the orbits and positions of or around 800 heavenly bodies or so to within 1/120th of a degree before the telescope was even invented. So, you know, he's really, really into his work, really good at it, so into it, in fact, that once he was at, I believe it was a wedding reception, and he started a conversation with another 1500s gentleman. And that 1500s gentleman thought he was better at math, and Tycho thought he was better at math, and neither of them could stand that, so they did what any respectable 1500s gentleman would do. They got up, ruined the whole wedding reception by having a duel. And they fought with swords. Tycho lost his nose. He was stuck with a metal nose for the rest of his life because of his ego over math. So he took his stuff very seriously, but it wasn't all super serious. I mean, he had parties back at Uraniborg Castle, which on one occasion featured a drunken elk, pet of his, rampaging through the castle, and on many more occasions, a little man named Jep. And Jep would hide under his dining room table during dinner parties, and he would feed Jep scraps from the table, and Jep would pop up from time to time and spout prophecies. So, basically, once again, to sum up, you have this super rich, super genius in his underground lair full of minions next to his torture dungeon on an island in the middle of the sea who, when he isn't busy with his drunken elk and his prophecy-spouting dwarf jester, is overturning the scientific world with his inventions and with the naked eye. And that's another kind of story that I'm really into, and a way to get it across. Fun narrative with humor.
Good. So the rebellious state gets into the personal, and the history gets into the bigger picture. So do you want to say something more about the impact of history upon you, and maybe you might come back with the same thing with what?
Yeah, yeah. It was pretty significant for me. I mean, one of the reasons I love history so much is because it lets me get into the minds of other people. So, I get to see the world as they saw it. I get to learn what they learned. And that started to gel for me in my 10th grade European civilization class. We had a bunch of, kids in their shirts and ties and their school uniforms, right, sitting around Mr. Carey. And Mr. Carey lobbed one ism after the next at us. You had economic philosophies like capitalism. You had approaches to rights like individualism, totalitarianism, lenses on social issues like social Darwinism and feminism, list goes on. And all of these isms, I started to realize, are really distillations of the ideas of humanity. And I got to really engage with those, and I also started to wonder, where they're coming from. And it started to hit me that it's really from their own experiences that these ideas come from, and that the way we think is shaped not entirely, but to a very significant degree by the experiences that we have. And storytelling really opens up those experiences, opens us up to a lot more, and that was one of the things that I started to realize and made me value storytelling.
And what I heard in what you're saying is the importance of listening.
Yeah.
You want to say
definitely.
something about that?
Yeah, and I think listening has taught me a lot. Just being in a situation where you're workshopping with people, having the patience and learning about people's experiences are really valid. From an academic standpoint, I think it's really fascinating because stories are just something that they're fun, they're conversation, they're narrative. It's life. It has a very personal element. And then you can also have it in a more studious sense, or in English and theater, we are studying stories a lot, all the time, and it's really tricky to learn how to break down conventions of narrative, and you learn just kind of cracking that question of what makes a good story. And I think with real life stories too, and when you listen to other people's stories, you have to just be aware of reality versus fiction. Sort of thing, and really putting them as the expert of their own story too, as tell us about this experience. You went through it. What do you want us to know? Those are some things I've learned are really helpful in having people share.
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
On that note of just hearing someone else's personal story, I think something that can do for us, because so many of our personal interactions are with strangers, or they're professional, or they're kind of those shallow catch-up conversations that you have with friends and family, right? And for some, some people, because there's a lot of that, can kind of get into your head that everyone else's life is drier, or kind of, just wow, you've got this really complex internal life that you're living all the time. But when you hear a really good story, whether it's on stage or whether it's sitting across a table or just from your friend, whoever, it reminds you that other people, it's really humanizing. It reminds you other people have that really cool internal world as well, I think. Yeah.
Sure. And like even just hearing like dinner table conversations, or even with a stranger, people you know and don't know, learning about like empathy and the skill, I think, too, of empathy, and how much that's so central to any art form, and I'm sure history as well. Teaching people how to see something through someone else's perspective, because that's what the storyteller's goal is, for the audience to experience it as they did. So that's been really fascinating, being both seeing the onstage side as well as like behind the scenes. How do you encourage that in the storyteller?
So both of you find in history and in relationships, find that empathy, and you come back to the word listening, right? So how does listening relate to telling?
I think that you've got to it's like Celia, I think you were saying, is basically the storytelling's for the listener, and it can be for something like catharsis for some people, or getting something out there to do something well, but it's for the people who are listening to you. I mean, try, I guess, to imagine a world in which you didn't have any stories around you, right? You don't know anything going on in the lives of anyone else when they're away from you, which for most of us, most people, most of the time, you don't know how they think or how they feel about any of those experiences, which is another one of the things that matters to you most. So with that void, you don't have any acquaintances, you don't have any friends or buddies or true lovers or any of that. You don't have any of those relationships. And to make it more concrete, I guess, think about kind of what happens with a lot of kids around like middle school time, when little Billy gets back into the car from school and Dad says, hey, little Billy, how was your day? And little Billy just says, good. And then Dad says, well, do you want to tell me about it? Did anything interesting happen? And little Billy says, just classes and stuff. And then you kind of get what I'm talking about. And there's none of that. There's this, Dad doesn't get to connect with little Billy. He doesn't get to share in those experiences with him, doesn't get to laugh and say, that happened to me when I was in school, or kind of pat him on the back and say, I know what going through that is like, and I can help you out this way. You just get this really sad silence that hangs over the car the whole way home. And I think that sad silence and the gulf that creates would be part and parcel in our lives if it wasn't for storytelling.
And I also, in addition to that, wonder about, I guess, the larger question of, what makes a story versus an event? Like, Billy,
That's a good question.
Is a story just me going to the supermarket and I bought some orange juice, then I came home? Does that qualify as a story? Or, what are some, we think about the elements a lot as producers, searching for a theme and searching for what are the key ingredients that makes the audience want to listen, that you want the audience to know. And a lot of it revolves around emotion and people too. Rarely we have people go up there and tell a story that's completely alone. They were alone in a forest by themselves the whole time. There's always some other outside element. So I think it's really fascinating seeing how you can craft experience or just happenstance or into a more like narrative, and kind of where that line is.
So storytelling is really important in all of life generally. And you have any more thoughts about that? I mean, how does that work for you? And how does your experience as producers, how does that reveal itself when people get up on the stage, and where do you see that?
Yeah.
What are the clues?
I think it's always interesting when you workshop with someone and you've already heard their story once. You've heard sort of like the rough draft, and then when you hear them tell it on stage, most of the time it's changed a little bit. And it's interesting how you as the workshopper can give advice and like help people to frame some of the experiences, like in terms of, because there is a creativity to it, because part of storytelling is like memory. Like, oh, what do I remember? This happened, A, B, X. And then how much of it is, that creative craft of, I'm going to start, when I was wrestling with a bear in the woods, then go back to this thing, then go back to like this other past event. And that thing, that act is still very like, it's like a intellectual task that is, there's no clear-cut formula, and like, we don't want to give it a formula because we want it to feel authentic, and we want the storyteller to like own that experience as, yes, I helped craft this into something.
Yeah. And Celia talking a lot about our experience kind of with the personal stories. There's this contrast that exists in my mind because two of my biggest things are Moth and studying history. And when it comes to studying people in history, I'm been lucky enough to been exposed to American industrialists and Chinese cadres and Bedouin warriors and French peasants, right? And even though they're living lives that are so different from mine in a lot of ways, they're really different from me, and in places that are totally different from where I am, unlike the people more so who come and tell Moth stories, I'm still learning something from their experiences. Peasants or French peasants would be teaching me to kind of value a lot of technology that they had that I didn't, or and cadres, Chinese cadres, taught me to fear corruption. American industrialists also taught me to fear corruption, but also the value of hard work and individual potential. And Bedouin warriors really taught me to value peace and order, right? And there's all these kind of big ideas that are in that. But for the Moth, there's also wisdom and knowledge isn't just restricted to those big ideas and those big things. We've got our our own personal triumphs and kind of petty disputes or whatever, and all that kind of stuff comes out in the Moth a lot. And it's, to go back to something you were talking about a little bit earlier, it can be as simple as somebody went and had a terrible experience at a restaurant. They tell you about it, and you decide whether you go there. It can be much deeper and more meaningful. Like, you've never had a divorce in your family, but a close friend comes and tells you their story about them struggling through it, and that enables you to help them out in the future.
Yeah, and
help others out.
Yeah, and speaking of like stories that have like serious themes, I think I have learned a lot, especially this summer, like through my internship. I did a project with Applied Theater, which is where you work with a community to create a piece, a play. And so we worked with some staff members involved with like family justice centers in New York City, and people affected by domestic violence. And so just being in the room of like interviewing some of these people, staff members as well as survivors, you learn so much about like how storytelling, not only like it's a great event for Moth and it's fun and we all really enjoy it, but it also carries so much emotion, amount of like trauma, and just it gives people an outlet for that. And I found that to be really rewarding too, is like seeing how can you use any sort of artistic expression, but in this case we had some more storytelling monologues to help rebuild a community, to give voice to the community, to give access to either like students or an affected population that might struggle to release it in another way. That might be through learning as well. Like in school, maybe finding a more artistic outlet, or like understanding something better through a narrative versus like an equation.
So I hear in there that out of storytelling comes understanding and comes wisdom. Can you say something about what you see emerging from people who get up on the stage and do this, you know?
Yeah, I think it comes, I see a lot of confidence as well. I see understanding and wisdom, but also a lot of confidence in the person being able to, and maybe I mentioned before, but like owning the experience. But I definitely agree that the understanding and wisdom, I think, is so pertinent to the time delayed too. Because sometimes I've been to some other Moth events where we have a different age population, and people talk about, you know, when I was 20 and then when I was 40. That I think is really fascinating, because the wisdom in that is like what events stuck out at 20 and 40, and that they're able to like reflect, and that process of reflection I think can be like really therapeutic and perhaps give that sort of understanding.
Good. Now, moth is a word that's become part of the language, and people know about the moth on radio, and it's nice that they are now learning about moth at the college. Maybe you could just briefly tell so we were clear about this. What is moth? What does that look like?
We should go into our stage spiel right now.
So,
So at the middle,
not too much,
Yeah.
but
well, at the Middlebury Moth Up, we have 5 storytellers, all of whom get up and tell.
true stories told live without notes.
Yeah.
So those are the 2 rules.
those are the rules.
Yep.
Okay.
And usually it's a 1-hour show, and then we ask the audience a question related to the theme of the night, and the theme changes every month. And they're really fun because we read the answer throughout the show, and people volunteer to tell stories, and the themes change. And really the audience questions are really fun part of it as well.
So the storytellers participate, but so does the audience as well.
Yeah,
That's great.
definitely.
Now,
Yeah.
the two, we may be coming close to the end of our time. There's a question that we have at the end. You've talked about storytelling as if it's a kind of unadulterated good. Okay, it's the best thing. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Another generation might say that. So I believe in that too. But tell me, do you really think this is so? Is there another part to this that needs to be lifted up about storytelling?
Well, I mean, storytelling can get abused all the time, right? You can tell, if you're a parent, you can tell your daughter one cautionary tale after the next until she becomes jaded and cynical. Or, you know, you can tell somebody a false stories if it's true and mislead them. You can create a national myth that causes a war. You've got all sorts of things that storytelling can be abused with, but all of the things that I think we've talked about, storytelling done well, storytelling done right, not only gives some people, something more substantive than platitudes, or concrete than ideology, or more human than statistics, or kind of just a analytical argument, but it can also, I think, just be one of the, on top of everything we've talked about, just one of the greatest simple pleasures in life.
That's a great way for us to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we wish you all the best in storytelling
Thank
in
you.
the Moth
Thanks.
and in your careers.
Yeah, thanks so much.
So we'll just set for a minute and wait for us to contemplate.